Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Ben Price with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and we're going to be talking about my book, How Wealth Rules the World. So we've shortened it for the webinar, How Wealth Rules. And last week, we covered most of part 2. And I'll just let you know that part 2 is actually chapter 1. The part 1 was the introduction, which was kind of an overview. So this evening, I want to finish up what we did not get to in part 2 last month. And that was in the first chapter, which is titled Property is Not an Unalienable Right. And so just to finish that up, there are a couple subsections left. And just to go back and review just a very little bit. Key concepts that we talked about in the first chapter had to do with property not being an unalienable right. And we talked about unalienable and alienable rights. And we also talked about the concepts of privileged property and personal property. And I'm going to go through that really quickly. If there's still remaining questions about it, some of that will get cleared up, I think, as we get into part 3 this evening. But let me see if I can give you a real fast overview of those concepts. So when I say that property isn't an unalienable right, when we talk about unalienable, it means that it's a kind of thing that can't be separated from the person to whom it's attached. It's sort of like your eye color. Your eye color is your eye color, and that's the way it is. Unalienable is not a concept that works well in the context of property. Property is something that not everybody is born with equally. And that's one of the requirements for something to be an unalienable right, is that we each have it equally, in equal measure, and that it can't be separated from us. And clearly, property can be separated in lots of ways, some of them honest, some of them not. You can sell it, you can have your property stolen, you can trade it. There are innumerable ways that we covered some of that last month. Alienable rights are ones that you still have a right. You have a right to your property, but you don't have, but it is possible to separate yourself from it. And so you can, sell your home or your land or whatever it might be. But there's these other concepts, these other terms that I use, personal property, which I generally define as property that it is created by the sweat of your brow, if you will. It is property that you gain from personal effort, whether that's intellectual effort or physical effort or creativity, whatever it might be. That belongs to you, but not, and as we could say, as an unalienable right, but it's not because the property ownership itself is an unalienable right. We're going to get into this a little bit in part 3, but it really has to do with the idea that the efforts that you put into creating something that you consider your property, then to build a home or to plow a field and plant your crops and so forth, it's actually your labor. It's your freedom from servitude that is unalienable. The fruit of your labor can't be claimed as the property by someone else, or you are not free from servitude. And so that is where the right to that personal property comes from. Privileged property, I talked about last month, and it's kind of a peculiar thing. And we gave a couple of examples, but it's when the law attaches certain privileges, certain extra rights to the ownership of a particular kind of property. And the property itself is kind of a vessel that holds those legal rights until someone comes into possession of that privileged property, at which time those extra privileges actually are enjoyed by the owner of the privileged property. An example I gave was under the 3/5 clause of the Constitution when it was ratified, that the states that allowed for the ownership of human beings through slavery claimed that their enslaved people were their property, and that their property were not human beings or citizens in the eyes of the law. They were property and therefore rightless. And the owner of privileged property, or any property for that matter, has the authority to do what they want with their property, up to and including destroying or killing it. So if it's your farm animal, you can raise it and then slaughter it for food. If it's your slave, you can work it to death. I mean, that was the view of it. It's nobody's business but the owners, and the law has no business stepping in and intervening. And so that's the general idea. The privileged property is actually a vessel for extra privileges that then are conveyed to whoever comes into possession of the privileged property. And I think it'll get more clear to you as we get into part 3 tonight and talk about some other examples. So finishing up part 2, which again, the chapter was Property is Not an Unalienable Right. I just want to say that there's a convergence in law between the idea of commerce and conquest. We talked about the conquest of the Western Hemisphere and the drawing of a line by the Pope from the North Pole to the South Pole to split the Western Hemisphere in half with that line. That line became a law, essentially, a property line, if you will, that granted full property benefits to the nations of the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. Those lines have changed since then, but the idea of those property lines and those national boundaries and so forth, that idea has not changed. So picking up from where we left off last month, I'll begin by saying that the owner of privileged property is a privileged recipient of the rights that are attached to that property. But since we know that ownership of wealth is not an unalienable right, and that the font of all legal rights in property is the community, which codifies such privileges in law, therefore owners of all property are privileged with rights not held in common by the community members. So they're not equal rights. Property rights are a different sort. And so moving on from there, whether or not those property laws were mutually agreed upon or coerced from the community is a serious matter for discussion. And that discussion is part of the social critique of my book, How Wealth Rules. The idea that the community actually creates property, I'm using community in the idealized sense that there's a democratic process and that the law reflects that democratic process. But in effect, property does not exist without a law backing it up. To say something is mine, to say this acreage is mine, doesn't carry any weight unless the government, the ruling authority in that jurisdiction, recognizes that claim and codifies it in law, for instance, in a deed or a title. Let's keep in mind that what unalienable rights exist in personal property really stem from the right to be free from involuntary servitude, as I said a moment ago. So that property generated by one's own labor or creativity can't be claimed as the property of someone else. Ownership of such property needs no community sanction or law, but because theft through forced servitude has blighted society for so long, laws that are protective of personal property and freedom from servitude have been necessary. In the rare instances where such laws have taken root, protection against involuntary servitude, that is, they're under constant assault by would-be aristocrats and people who would like to have advantages over the rest of the community. But while they hold, laws protective of human rights make it a crime to deprive another of the means of subsistence. Had such laws been effective over time, the enclosure and privatization of the commons would not have been allowed. But today, every imaginable form of enclosure is pursued in law by antisocial forces. Under rights protective laws, withholding the full value of an employee's work would be theft by the employer. Unfortunately, rights attached to the accumulation of property are today more powerfully and regularly enforced than human and civil rights and the right to a living wage, for instance. One of the other philosophers of the era of the Enlightenment, I talked about some of those in covering the earlier part of part 2. John Locke wrote that government has no other end but the preservation of property. This is John Locke. This is a philosopher who was taken seriously at the time that the US Constitution was being drafted and ratified. And he believed that government has no other end but the preservation of property. American revolutionaries like Thomas Paine, when he wrote Common Sense, and Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, had other aspirations. For them, the purpose of government is securing unalienable rights, including the right to one's own labor and the product of it, and the right of the people to engage in self-government without deference to the priorities of wealth. But in America and in nations around the globe whose social contract is rooted in conquest and colonialism, the ethics of power and possession prevailed, and not that revolutionary idea and that fomented the American Revolution that was based in unalienable rights and the right of the people to govern themselves. Now, the next subsection in part 2 for us to cover is titled Workers and the Law Serve Wealth. That's not the ideal situation. That's the situation that we find ourselves in. Benjamin Franklin, corresponding with the wealthiest man in the American colonies, that's the financier of the Revolution, Robert Morris, wrote this, quote, all the property that is necessary to a man for the conservation of the individual and the propagation of the species is his natural right, which none can justly deprive him of, but all property superfluous to such purposes is the property of the public, who by their laws have created it, and who may therefore by other laws dispose of it whenever the welfare of the public shall demand such a disposition. We don't usually think of Benjamin Franklin as being quite so, I don't know what you want to call it, socialistic, shall we say? He's certainly not sounding like a capitalist here, that the only property that anyone can claim without getting the sanction of the community is that which is created by that person's own hands or creativity. So let's be clear about where privileged property comes from, as opposed to where the right to one's personal property comes from. In all cases, law creates property. That's what we're getting at here. We aren't born with it. Whether it's the nuns' land and chapel in the woods that we talked about that was destroyed by the pipeline company that commandeered the right-of-way through their sanctuary, law and government decide who owns what, who got what. And in that case, eminent domain said that the pipeline company got the nuns' land, even though it wasn't the pipeline company's. In all cases, law creates property. So that goes for all types of property. Since all property exists subject to legal consent, Law can either recognize a claim of ownership or deny it. What law cannot legitimately deny is the right to be free from servitude where the fruit of one's labor belongs to another. Of course, that idea was not something that the Federalists who wrote the US Constitution believed in when they legalized the ownership of human beings and slavery as an institution of the United States. What law can't legitimately assert is that the value of wages, of the wages of servitude in whole or in part, belongs to the master of the worker in pursuit of wealth. But as we see, law readily and constantly does both. American law has acknowledged a right to be free from involuntary servitude, included but not limited to slavery, since adoption of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Section 1 of the amendment says that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, end quote. We're examining the question of servitude in order to illustrate the difference between personal property and privileged property. The one, the right to own and control one's own labor and the fruit of that labor, that is the use of one's own body and mind to produce added value and thereby profit, is unalienable. It's not the added value, the personal property itself, that is unalienable. It is the liberty from labor for the benefit of another that is unalienable. So when the rights are bestowed upon property itself, as when corporate property becomes the repository of Bill of Rights protections, according to the US Supreme Court, then law acts to protect additive acquisition, which I'm referring to as privileged property, instead of the self-evident right of human beings to own and control their own bodies and minds. It's the word involuntary in the 13th Amendment that so clearly reveals that the amendment was never intended to end the legal advantages of masters over workers or to guarantee freedom from servitude as a constitutionally protected right. The essence of unalienable rights is that they cannot be separated from the person, not even voluntarily. By including the word involuntary in the 13th Amendment, servitude of poor people to wealthy people was preserved as a legally allowable arrangement. In the eyes of the law, freedom from servitude is not an unalienable right, although I am asserting in my writings that, in fact, it is and should be seen so. Legal scholar Morrison R. Cohen wrote that, quote, the character of property as sovereign power, compelling service and obedience, may be obscured for us in the commercial economy by the fiction of the so-called labor contract as a free bargain and by the frequency with which service is rendered indirectly through a money payment. But there is actually little freedom to bargain on the part of the steelworker or miner who needs a job. Today, I do not directly serve my landlord if I wish to live in the city with a roof over my head, but I must work for others to pay him rent, with which he obtains the personal services of others. The money needed for the purchasing of things must, for the vast majority, be acquired by hard labor and disagreeable service to those to whom the law has accorded dominion over the things necessary for subsistence. End quote. Once personal constitutional protections are waived by private contract, public law and the protections of the Bill of Rights are powerless to intervene. I'm going to say it again. Once a contract intervenes, and contracts are seen as private law, not public law. Once personal constitutional protections are waived by private contract, public law and the protections of the Bill of Rights are powerless to intervene. Public law that would normally protect your rights in a just society, you can actually waive them according to the theory of contract. Contract being private law and contract being a matter of property. In other words, property law trumps human and civil rights law. The employee may be required to surrender free speech, assembly, privacy, religious, and other rights on the job as a contractual condition of employment. Each unalienable right becomes alienable. Each conditional right becomes moot. Rights of persons are made subordinate to rights in corporate property. Private law is given deference over public law. Minority interest trump general rights. Immunity against community is institutionalized for a privileged aristocracy of wealth. Immunity against community is the same to me as saying immunity from democracy. And what strikes me as very odd is that any rights could be subject, any unalienable rights could be subject to voting, for people to vote should this person have them or not. Rights, if they're unalienable, aren't up for the community to give or take away. They simply are possessed by every one of us by right of being born. So I'm saying essentially at the bottom line, there's a bias in the law. A viable economy would still be possible if unalienable rights took precedent over property amassed as wealth. However, empire might not be possible. And empire is really at the heart of what we're talking about here. Why have this advantage of privileged property? Well, in monarchical societies, certainly it benefited a certain class of people, the aristocracy and the royalty. But there are other reasons in a nation where we don't have those bloodline privileges. There's another use for the privileges that are stowed in the vessel of privileged property. I'm going to pause there. We'll come to the next subsection and just see if there's any real quick thoughts or questions. And when I say quick, I'd like to take maybe one or two, okay? So if you'd like to raise your hand, or if you'd like to put something in the chat, and if not, I'll just go on to the next section. Beth, go ahead.
This seems very abstract. I'm having a hard time coming up with specific cases that might occur where this would be where this distinction would be of significance, and not in a theoretical way, but in an everyday, right now, given the society we're in.
Mm-hmm. I think that and I'm going to finish up part 2 here as quickly as I can. I think we'll dive into it and give you some kind of real down-to-earth examples of what privileged property might look like. And I do want to say that although right now it certainly is a abstract concept, and I wish it weren't, and I wish it were a simple thing for us to pull apart and explain and understand. But frankly, the opaqueness of the law is intentional. It makes it unaccessible to the average American, me and you. I've tortured myself, forcing myself to try to insinuate myself into the complexities and understand it. And I can't pretend that I know it all. I don't. But I think there's some ideas that can be teased out from the obscurity of the law. My apologies for it being so abstract. I think that we'll get into some language that will make it a lot plainer this evening. So if you can bear with me a little bit, just keep in mind, privileged property, the concept is that it's the type that, for instance, if you were a slave owner in the South prior to the Civil War, your ownership of slaves gave you more representation in the House of Representatives and in choosing the president, because the 3/5 clause of the US Constitution counted slaves as 3/5 of a person when doing the census in order to decide proportional representation for each of the states. And so states that allowed for slavery would count slaves as 3/5 of a human being, even though they could not vote, and counting them as extra members um, of the population meant that those slave states would send more representatives to the House of Representatives in Congress, and they would also send more representatives, more delegates to the Electoral College, and the Electoral College would then choose the president. And by the way, that hasn't changed. We all think we're voting for a president, when in fact, when we go in and we check off a name, we're actually voting for certain delegates who have committed themselves to vote in the Electoral College for that candidate on a first round. So just as an example, the 3/5 clause is one of the early examples of privileged property. We'll come to some others here shortly. The next subsection of this chapter is called Unequal Protection, the myth of equality before the law.
Ben, real quick,
Yes.
there's one other hand raised.
Marion, I'm sorry. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Marion?
Just remember to unmute, Marion, so we can hear you.
I just wanted to say that those delegates can change their minds about who they're voting for.
Yeah, they sure can, because we're voting for people that we hope will do what we think they're going to do, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
That's very true. However, by owning slaves and living in one of those states that allowed it, you also lived in a state that got more representation proportionally than did non-slave states. And so the extra governing privilege, it's very specific. It's a governing privilege that was gained through ownership of slaves, enslaved people. Tom, you have your hand up?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So if I have a piece of property that I have bought through my own labor versus inherited, is that considered property or privileged property? Does that have that distinction of being privileged property if it's passed on through generations?
It's a little dicey. I would say that if it's inherited, that's not gained by your own effort. And we'll get into, I'm going to talk about Thomas Paine and an idea he had in connection with that inherited property and land and so forth. That may explain it a little bit more. I really think that it has more to do with your own effort and your own creativity, your own physical work and so forth. And the rest of it is, does it mean that you shouldn't own it? The law says you can. Is it privileged property? Are there extra privileges attached to the property? That's the question. In the case of the nuns and the pipeline that we talked about last month, the pipeline obviously had the privilege of taking their land for its own profit.
Right.
And the nuns did not have the privilege of keeping their land. And so their land did not have those privileges attached to it.
Right.
So
the government can take the government can take by eminent domain whether you acquired this property through your own labors or whether you inherited it.
That's true. And the other issue though is it used to be that eminent domain was something that was okay and generally accepted, if begrudgingly, if the use of the land was going to benefit the community, so for the general welfare. What's changed in the past 30, 40 years is that eminent domain has been used vigorously to take private property and give it to other private owners for their own private profit. The claim is, well, we all want natural gas, right? Well, no, we
Right.
don't all. And the other thing is that the pipeline that was going through was heading straight to an export terminal so that the gas could be sold abroad. So no, it was not for the common good. And so even if eminent domain has a legitimate use, it has now fallen into illegitimacy, I would argue.
Yeah, their argument is that it is still by for public. You know, if you have forced pooling, for example, I own land in West Virginia with mineral rights, and,
Right.
and you know, and I've refused to sign contracts, and but I've been on the edge of being forced.
Right, and they say, well, if you don't do it, we'll take your land anyway, the right, and then you won't get paid what we promised you in the beginning. And I don't want to dive into this too
Right.
much, so we can move on. But just to say, yeah, that's a illegitimate, I would argue, use of eminent domain that has become routine, and so now it's simply kind of an oppression. So the next heading I was going to get started on here is unequal protection, the myth of equality before the law. The species of privileged property have proliferated unchecked for a century and a half through modification of the law. From simple interest on loans to compounding interest, from mineral rights to intellectual property rights, from naming rights to copyrights, from stocks and bonds to future profits, from proprietary rights to corporate rights, from legal standing to engineered legal precedent. The list of ways legal privileges for wealth have been institutionalized has flourished with no sign of stopping. Adam Winkler, professor of constitutional law at UCLA School of Law, has written an entertaining book titled We the Corporations, How American Business Won Their Civil Rights. The author tells the story from the droll perspective of victimized corporations struggling for justice and how they gained constitutional rights from the Supreme Court. He compares the pursuit of legal advantages for wealthy people and their corporate property to a civil rights movement. It's a clever device, but Winkler makes a more serious historical observation that whereas it only required the wealthy ask for their rights for their chartered property, asked the Supreme Court. That is, it took decades of abolitionist struggles, a civil war, and 3 constitutional amendments to free African Americans from the status of rightless property. And still, the United States is a nation of apartheid. A laughably baseless interpretation of the 14th Amendment let the Supreme Court change corporate property into a person with protections of the law equal to that afforded to humans. That was in 1886, 34 years before the Constitution was amended to recognize the right of women to vote. To this day, women lack an equal rights amendment, while corporations have been guaranteed equal rights with men under the 14th Amendment for over a century. Corporations, that's a type of privileged property, if you want a specific and familiar form. A corporation is simply a piece of paper. It's a form of property. And the US Supreme Court has vested that corporate property with constitutional protections under the Bill of Rights. And so whoever then gains ownership and control of that corporation, that person or those people gain an extra scoop of rights, an extra scoop of privileges that the rest of the community does not share in. That's what I mean by privileged property. Corporations are the most familiar form today of privileged property, I think. So the lesson here is that the American system of law assures wealth access to the entire into the Supreme Court to protect rights and property, while ordinary people have no automatic way to get into the halls of justice to secure their rights. In the last pages of his book, Professor Winkler tells the story of Mora County, New Mexico, and the Moore County Community Water Rights and Self-Government Act of 2013. It's an ordinance I had a hand in drafting and shepherding to adoption at the request of community members and the county commissioner, John Olivas, I should say. Winkler holds our ordinance up as an example of how communities might push back against the hegemony of wealth and the privatization of the Federal Bill of Rights by attaching it to private property in the form of a corporation. The county law, the Moore County law, declared that because water is indispensable to life, it is an unalienable right. It declared the corporation's property interest in natural gas, its mineral rights, are not unalienable. And it held that unalienable rights supersede the inferior rights in property. That was the Moore County law that we drafted, and it was enacted. Later that same year, the Independent Petroleum Institute of New Mexico and a couple of similarly interested individuals sued Moore County for adopting an ordinance banning the extraction of fossil fuels within the county. The lawsuit claimed the ordinance violated the corporation's First, Fifth, and 14th Amendment rights in the Bill of Rights. It was a civil rights lawsuit against the county, a civil rights lawsuit because the corporate person's rights were being violated by a government entity, the county government. Here's what the Independent Petroleum Institute of New Mexico said about our work in community rights. They published this in their regular magazine. Quote, "The community rights and rights of nature movement is the beginning of a social movement that is greater than just the oil and gas industry. It is a potential game changer for all of corporate America." That's a pretty astounding thing. And by the way, we haven't seen it reprinted anywhere. I think they realized they shouldn't have let the magazine publish that quote. But we've got it. It's in print. And I think that we know that they're afraid that if we succeed, their extra scoops of privilege aren't going to be there and quite so handy. So I'm going to move along a little bit more quickly here so that we can get into part 3. Any questions on what I've just talked about here about the privileged property, about the Bill of Rights being attached to corporate property, creating in that way privileged property? Marion? Yeah, you're muted, Marion.
How can a community make any headway with protecting the environment, their own environment, if corporations can just sue them out of existence? I mean, corporations have a lot of money. They can afford to go to court. A lot of communities can't. I mean, they can't. I know Grant Township finally managed to, but over 10 years, I mean, what community has that kind of money?
Well, Grant Township certainly didn't have that kind of money. And here's the thing, Grant Township, look, we've been standing by them for over 10 years, but they lost every step in the court system. What does that mean? It means that the law is on the side of wealth and not on the side of human beings, people, or nature. And so how can a community win against a corporation under current law? Marion, the answer is you can't, not under the law. We have to win other ways. And that means we have to change the system by making it irrelevant one way or the other. The totality of this book is about not just showing you the shocking fact that we're not allowed legally to protect the environment. It's illegal to protect the environment in the United States. If it interferes with money making, it's illegal because it's a violation of the civil rights of corporate property. It's illegal. But it's not illegal to poison people and take away their civil rights. Why? Well, because wealth rules, not poverty, not simple rights.
But I am trying to get a rights of nature law in my community. I'm afraid to tell them that they could be taken to court for this because I'm afraid that people will just walk away.
Well, my theory is in my community organizing is to always start out by saying, and not the very first thing, but by being honest, absolutely honest. Real good chance if that company wants their pipeline through this land, you're going to see a lawsuit come against the municipality if you pass this law. But if you don't pass this law, you're going to get the pipeline without the fight. Which way do you want to go? And then there's the example of Grand Township. It took 10 years, but they still don't have a frac waste injection well. I'm going to move on if you don't mind, Marion. I see that Karen has a hand up, and then we really do have to move on. Karen, you're on mute.
So you're saying that in order to change this, you have to be willing, or community has to be willing to fight with nonviolent resistance. Is that right?
Well, and yes, but nonviolent, let's not get too scary, because nonviolent resistance in the case of Mora County and in the case of Grant Township, that where they're plugging that planned injection well now, you know, that nonviolent resistance came in the form of passing a law, and then passing another law, and then going to court and defending that law, and then going, you know, they started with an ordinance in Pennsylvania as a second-class township. And then when that was being challenged in court, they went home rule. There's a process in Pennsylvania to create their home rule community. So then they adopted a charter that included the ban on the injection well in it. So now there was a second speed bump for the corporation to overcome. And then the DEP got involved. I mean, I can't give you the whole story here, but just to say, nonviolent disobedience, civil disobedience, can look a lot of ways. It can be a sit-in, it can be holding signs and, you know, and chaining yourself, or, you know, tree sitting in a forest, or whatever it is. We called it nonviolent civil disobedience through local lawmaking. And so it's another way, and it may not be the way for everybody. Other ways are, and one of the things that we're exploring and we'll be going public with hopefully this year, is alternative systems. How do you create in your community other systems of getting things done that make the government irrelevant? We don't need you because you don't work for us anyway, in other words. How can we be self-help communities? How can we be working in collaboration with other communities to help each other, since government, all they're interested in doing is taking our land, our resources, and handing it over to profiteers? How can we make a change in that system? So I'm going to move on. We're going to get into part 3. And so, my goodness, we're going to run out of time. Part 3 is actually chapter 2, the ongoing counter-revolution. What the Federalists did, the ones who wrote the federal Constitution, was quite ingenious. What they did is disguise their preference for a constitutional monarchy as a revolutionary republic, incorporating 3 words suggestive of a system rooted in democratic principles. But instead, they erected a wealth-based aristocracy that did not look at all like what the revolutionaries were demanding. What were the 3 words that they used in the Constitution? We the people. They started out with we the people. Nothing in the document that follows those 3 words constitutes a system that is controlled by the people, unless we understand the people are subsequently defined in that text as white males who possess wealth. What do I mean by this? Well, under the new system, who among the we the people would have power to govern? Would women? No. Would African Americans? No. Would Native Americans? No. Would white men?
Ben, I apologize. I clicked the wrong button and accidentally muted you.
I'm sorry.
No, that was my apologies. So if you don't mind backing up maybe a sentence or 2.
Okay. So under the new system, under the new constitution, who of those we the people actually had power to govern? And I'm asking the question, would women? No. Would African Americans? No. Would Native Americans? No. Would white men without property, without land? No. Most states had property requirements for white men to vote and or hold office. What about the first 10 amendments, the so-called Bill of Rights? We began discussing the mechanism of privileged property as a tool for transferring governing authority away from we the people and into the hands of that wealthy minority of white men. Essentially, the purpose of my book has been to expose the trickery and the opacity of the system that was put into effect. The Federalists created a system to assuage the distrust of the majority that a new authoritarian system was being proposed. They accomplished that scam by making its mechanisms too legalistic and arcane for the revolutionaries to recognize it as just more of what they went to war against England to stop. I'm going to begin here with a quote from the French social critic Jacques Ellul, who is the author of a book called Propaganda. It's a very good book, a bit dense though. But in another book, the Technological Society, he wrote this, quote, "Natural necessity no longer exists. It is technique's necessity which becomes the more constraining, the more nature's necessity fades and disappears." What does he mean by technique's necessity? Well, to answer it, I'll quote Frederick Bastiat, who I did last time, and he said this: when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. So when there's a need to create a system that supports the acquisition, accumulation of property and power, a legal system can be devised. And I'm arguing that's exactly what was done. So in chapter 2 of my book that we're covering here, which again is called The Ongoing Counter-Revolution, it starts with this quote, and it's from Anne M. Burkhart in her essay, The Constitutional Underpinnings of Homelessness. It was published in the Houston Law Review. Quote, "The uniformity of the framers' economic status had a predictable impact on the Constitution. It provides protections for property rights and limits the political powers of the poor. In contrast, it does not provide for the needs of the lower classes. Instead, those provisions focused on the poor are designed to suppress insurrections, to prohibit state debtor relief laws, and to prevent property redistributions." The first subheading in the chapter is titled, "Where Do Rights Reside? In People or in Property?" Until the American Revolution, the proprietorship colony of Pennsylvania, which is where I live, was run by a General Assembly overseen by the descendants of William Penn. It was made up of Quaker members of the commercial elite. They opposed independence because of their business dealings with England, and without Pennsylvania on board, other states refused to endorse secession from the empire. Only wealthy white men were represented in the General Assembly, and as in most of the colonies, voting and holding office was open only to white men with substantial property. That left out most men and most other men and everyone else as well. Thanks to some backroom chicanery by Sam and John Adams, they were cousins, Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Benjamin Rush, poor men from the rural countryside gathered and descended on the State House in Philadelphia, where both the Pennsylvania General Assembly and the Constitutional Congress were meeting. The rabble tossed out their colonial betters, the Quakers, when they refused to send delegates to the Continental Congress with instructions to support a declaration of independence from England. And they would have only had to send those delegates upstairs to the Continental Congress in what we call Constitution Hall in Philadelphia now. The rabble tossed out their colonial betters when they refused to send delegates. The insurgents elected their own representatives to the General Assembly, and they quickly put Pennsylvania on the side of secession from the empire. With Pennsylvania on board, the scales tipped in the Continental Congress' favor of separation from the empire. Then the propertyless assembly got busy writing the first constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. When they gathered to draft their 1776 state constitution, the rabble-run General Assembly decided to break with British tradition and allow all men, white and black as a matter of fact, to vote and hold office in Pennsylvania, whether they were rich or poor. Benjamin Franklin was instrumental in crafting that early state constitution. To justify dropping property qualifications, he told this story, and this will give you maybe a little bit more understanding of what I mean by privileged property. Quote, today a man owns a jackass worth $50 and he's entitled to vote. But before the next election, the jackass dies. The man, in the meantime, has become more experienced. His knowledge of the principles of government and his acquaintance with mankind are more extensive, and he is therefore better qualified to make proper selection of rulers. But the jackass is dead, and the man cannot vote. Now, gentlemen, pray inform me, in whom is the right of suffrage, in the man or in the jackass? Without the jackass, the man can't vote. The jackass is the privileged property. It conveys the privilege to participate in government. And so Franklin argued for dropping the property qualification, and they did. They also dropped any racial reference in the Constitution so that only males, of course, but white and black males could vote and hold office up to 1838, when a reactionary government stripped that out of the Constitution and made it refer only to white males. So it's a very clear example, Franklin's idea here, of privileged property. This story is worth keeping in mind as we consider less obvious forms of privileged property. For instance, when we turn to constitutional mechanisms like the Commerce Clause, we'll focus on how wealth is used to weaponize law against democracy. In writing the U.S. Constitution, the Federalists saw to it that when enough wealth is accumulated to allow its owners to engage in commerce across state borders, governance of interstate trade is commandeered from the states by the federal government. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution forbids state and local lawmakers to regulate the exchange of goods, services, and finance across state lines. Only Congress can do that. Interference with wealth's extraterritorial reach, regardless of its impact locally, is thus prohibited. And there you can kind of begin to extrapolate how we're in such a mess when we try to protect the environment and stop pipelines that cross state boundaries and so forth. How the Commerce Clause and other constitutional mechanisms infringe on the people's right of self-government will become clear as we consider real-life examples of how rights in property exempt the wealthy from public governance, while at the same time empowering private law to be publicly enforced. Private law is contract law. Private law is corporations law. But before we zip too quickly into current events, let's have another look at how in the past public rights were crudely privatized, vested in property, and how governing was made the exclusive privilege of those owning wealth. In 1841 to 42, a little-known civil war was fought in the state of Rhode Island. It was called the Dorr War, D-O-R-R. Rhode Island was the last holdout where state laws allowed ownership of land to determine which white men would govern. The followers of Thomas Dorr, who led the rebellion against the state, held their own constitutional convention and created a competing state government during the uprising. To justify adopting their people's constitution in defiance of the state's legislature and without following the rules that let only landowners participate in amending the constitution, they published a note from the so-called 9 lawyers. One of their arguments for the invalidity of the old constitution, which the freemen benefited from because they maintained the suffrage by right of land ownership, was that the American Revolution took sovereignty away from the king and gave it to the people as a whole. And here's what the 9 lawyers said in their statement, quote, "It held that the sovereign power of a state is the power which prescribes the form of government. In Rhode Island at the Revolution, it passed to the whole people. For if to a part of the people, owners of land, then it really passed to the soil itself. In which case, the soil, the land, is what I've been referring to as, again, privileged property, the power to participate in government by voting and holding office, depended on ownership of land. With the end of the Boer War, the civil rights struggle of the propertyless white men came to an end in the United States. The achievement of what they called universal manhood suffrage disarmed the property class of one of the weapons they had deployed against democracy. Despite that setback, vesting sovereign governing rights in property was just getting off the ground. It would evolve into the most powerful political and social tool ever defined in law. I'm going to cruise on through to the next section, the enclosure of the commons. Today, we call it privatization. If you have questions or comments, jot them down and we'll try to put them all together here. It will be wise to remind ourselves of the history of the British enclosures. It is emblematic of the transference of public rights from the majority into the private possession of a privileged minority. The enclosures in England ended traditional rights in land. For 3 centuries, the enclosure movement took land that had formerly been shared in common by all and changed it to privately owned land, always with lines on paper to document the appropriation, like the Pope's line on a map of the Western Hemisphere that divided that hemisphere into domains ruled by Spain and Portugal. The English government and aristocracy justified the enclosing of land with claims that large fields could be farmed more efficiently than individual plots. Some claimed that putting an end to subsistence farming and consolidating land and control would yield greater commercial benefits. Similar claims about efficiencies of scale continue to be made today to rationalize the corporatization of agriculture and the privatization of schools and medicine in the United States. Enclosure and privatization, like the chartering of private corporations, have been extremely efficient at concentrating privileges for those entitled to reap profits while leaving everyone else at a severe disadvantage. Independent subsistence living essentially was outlawed. Only dependence on the empire for subsistence would be tolerated. Indigenous communities in colonized lands were destroyed the way homeless encampments are dismantled today. It wasn't only farmland that was privatized and expropriated in England from communities under the British enclosures. According to historian Linebaugh and Rediker, quote, "At the end of the 15th century, when water was drawn to London through wooden pipes, the Fellowship of the Brotherhood of St. Christopher of the Water Bearers of London did most of the hauling from the conduits. Water was free. In 1581, this changed as the first privately owned pumped water supply was constructed at the London Bridge. We have water companies now instead of water carriers. By the 1600s, the era of free water by right had ended. Another commons expropriated. Expropriating the necessities of life and externalizing, in other words, making public the cost of making a private profit became the new norm. Today, the efficiencies of privatization are noticeably calculated without regard to harms inflicted on society and the planet. Nestle and Coca-Cola corporations owned legal monopolies to aquifers around the world at a time of growing freshwater scarcity. Opposing the enclosures today means taking unalienable rights seriously and acting on the premise that our communities have not only full authority, but a duty to protect those unalienable rights. In 2008, the people behind the property known as the Nestle Corporation quietly sank 23 test wells in a supposedly protected forest in the New Hampshire town of Nottingham, unknown to the community. This is a case that Michelle Sanborn is quite familiar with. She lives in New Hampshire and has worked there with communities. When the wells were discovered, community members in Nottingham pulled together and planned to do something about it at their annual town meeting. For a few months, they worked behind the scenes with the help of Gail Darrell, CELDF's then New Hampshire community rights organizer, to draft an ordinance that would stop the Nestle Corporation from moving forward with plans to privatize the town's aquifer for a water bottling operation. The former chairman and CEO of Nestle, you may recall, was widely known for his statement that water is not a human right. The Nottingham ordinance was enacted overwhelmingly by a show of hands at the town meeting. It was titled the Nottingham Water Rights and Local Government Self-Government Ordinance. Among other declarations, in the preamble it states, "We the people of Nottingham declare that all our water is held in the public trust as a common resource to be used for the benefit of Nottingham residents and of natural ecosystems of which they are a part." The ordinance prohibited corporations from extracting groundwater within the town as a protection of the people's unalienable right to water, which is essential to life. In other towns across the continent, the same water extraction issues arise frequently. And there are many other instances of concentrated wealth exploiting communities and violating their rights. National and state land reserves are being opened to clear cutting, oil and gas extraction, and strip mining. Municipal water authorities, once part of the public domain, are being gutted, their mandate to serve public needs converted into tools for private profit. The same British merchant class that kicked traditional residents off privatized land during the enclosures prevailed on Parliament to make it illegal to be landless and masterless. Vagabonds faced imprisonment and indentureship, and whole families were delivered into bondage. The dispossessed of England, Scotland, and Ireland provided unpaid labor for expansion of the empire. Many were forced to serve wealthy masters in far-off lands and to labor without rights in the new colonies. Clearly, their right to be free of involuntary servitude was not being protected, while the right to own privileged property by that aristocracy in England were being religiously protected. When the supply of dispossessed Irish, Scottish, and other paupers who'd been Barbadosed to the colonies for their free labor was not enough, the empire began transporting kidnapped Africans to its colonies. Although England had no legal precedent for treating human beings as property, and although the central government strictly forbade its colonies from lawmaking for the benefit of the settlers, the Caribbean colonies were permitted to develop a body of law that defined African slaves as a new kind of property. And it was these colonial laws that were adopted, picked up by the Federalists, and incorporated essentially into the US Constitution when it was enacted. So first the land was privatized, next other people's labor was privatized, finally other people's lives were converted into property through slavery. The 13th Amendment is thought to have ended slavery, the commandeered ownership of other people and their work, but it did not. It ended ownership of human property, but still allows the enslavement of imprisoned people and still allows the value of the future labor of a debtor to be garnished, in other words, to be grabbed, by the creditor. As the law enhanced the privileges of creditors, of slave owners, and of landowners, the rights of debtors, the enslaved, and the disinherited were obliterated. And this is the misuse of law identified by Thomas Paine in his scathing critique of monarchy, aristocracy, and the law-backed privatization of privileges at the expense of collective community rights that define the method of empire building. Whether or not the Federalists foresaw the potential for turning charters of incorporation into instruments for empowering the property class and disempowering the rabble, it is certain that their revolutionary nemesis, Thomas Paine, understood the tyrannical nature of chartered privileges. He and revolutionaries like Sam Adams, who dumped the British East India Company's tea into Boston Harbor, knew firsthand how the commercial aristocracy had used charters as weapons of oppression prior to the Revolution. The Revolutionary Sons of Liberty distributed numerous broadsides against the corrupting influence of the great corporations of the era. The true revolutionaries, not the Federalists, understood that exclusive privileges and monopolies were ruinous to general rights. Thomas Paine had no illusions about the purpose of corporate charters. He explained in simple terms that they are legal tools that create advantages for a privileged few at the expense of everyone else. Paine was ridiculed mercilessly in the British press for writing that human rights are an inherent birthright superior to inheritable aristocratic privileges. He didn't rise to the bait of brutal political cartoons caricaturing him as Mad Tom. Instead, he went straight to the root of the problem, writing, quote, "I answer not to falsehood or abuse, but proceed to the defects of the English government. I begin with charters and corporations." It is a perversion of terms to say that a charter gives rights. It operates by a contrary effect, that of taking rights away. Rights are inherently in all of the inhabitants, but charters, by annulling those rights in the majority, leave the right by exclusion in the hands of a few. Those whose rights are guaranteed by not being taken away exercise no other rights than as members of the community they are entitled to without a charter. Therefore, all charters are instruments of injustice. The next section is titled, it's again about Tom Paine, focusing down, Mad Tom, Thomas Paine in the Royal Neck. Tom Paine proposed a system for remedying the oppressions of the enclosures. Paine was a radical thinker and questioned everything from the legitimacy of British monarchy, the beneficence of organized religion, and the justification for the American colonies remaining part of the empire. In January of 1776, Paine published his pamphlet titled Common Sense. In clear, simple language, he explained the absurdity of aristocratic government. He argued for independence from the British Empire and establishment of a government based on securing rights for all. The British press skewered the commoner Paine with political caricatures and named him Mad Tom, or the Man of Rights. His Common Sense pamphlet became an immediate bestseller. Just 6 months later, Paine's views on unalienable rights inspired dozens of communities to send delegates to the Continental Congress demanding a break with Britain. Thomas Jefferson soon got his commission to write the Declaration of Independence. Paine also wrote a lesser-known paper called Agrarian Justice, and I think I'll probably end up with this, and we'll pick up. There's very little to finish up unless people want to stay, but I want to talk about his Agrarian Justice. He proposed a reversal of the injuries brought about by the enclosures, the privatization of the commons. He understood the expropriation of land under color of law to be no more than rationalized theft. He had no tolerance for romanticizing imperial conquest as the spread of civilization, which is what its proponents argue. In his opening remarks to Agrarian Justice, he wrote, quote, "Whether that state that is proudly, perhaps erroneously called civilization, has most promoted or most injured the general happiness of man is a question that may be strongly contested. On one side, the the spectator is dazzled by splendid appearances. On the other, he is shocked by extremes of wretchedness, both of which he has erected. The most affluent and the most miserable of the human race are to be found in the countries that are called civilized. Paine went further to say that, quote, man did not make the earth, and though he had a natural right to occupy it, he had no right to locate as his property in perpetuity any part of it. Neither did the creator of the earth open a land office from whence the first title deeds should issue. But Paine did understand that there's a legitimate sense in which rights can be attached to land. He tells his readers that he intentionally titled his essay Agrarian Justice and not Agrarian Law, because common rights to the earth were tempered when humans turned from nomadic lives to cultivating the soil. He claimed that, quote, landed property began from the impossibility of separating the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself, till in the end the common right of all became confounded into the cultivated rights of the individual. Paine defended both of these rights. He said that all members of the community had been, quote, thrown out of their natural inheritance, unquote, as well as the rights of the one who cultivated the land. And then he went on to say, but the landed monopoly that began with it has produced the greatest evil. In advocating the case of the persons thus dispossessed, it is a right and not a charity that I am pleading for. To pay the rest of the community reparations for their common rights in land lost to cultivation and inseparable from the cultivated fields, Paine proposed a national fund. Out of this fund, every person, rich or poor, would be paid a certain sum at the age of 21, and then again at the age of 50, would continue to receive an annual sum in compensation. In other words, if the land belongs to the whole community in common, and some specific individuals are going to improve the land through their own labor by cultivating it, they're also going to essentially pay rent back to the community for using the land for their personal use. The monies of this national fund that was proposed would originate, quote, at the moment that property is passing by the death of one person to the possession of another, which kind of gets to the question of inheritance of land. In this case, the bequeather gives nothing, the receiver pays nothing. The only matter for him is that the monopoly of natural inheritance to which there never was a right begins to cease in his person. Thomas Paine saw his proposed national fund as a reasonable way to make amends for the loss of our common natural inheritance of the earth. And he's talking about farmland now. He's not talking about mineral rights and forest timbering and so forth. He's talking about the cultivation of land for food. And so there are some differences here. Today's apologists for amassed wealth see that the notion of an inheritance tax. They call it a death tax and promote that language to falsely accuse its promoters of stealing from the dead and from their children. Their unreasoned belief that property is an inherent and inheritable right, and that those with much owe nothing to the rest, conveniently ignores the pedigree of plunder and the privilege from which those riches sprang. I did see Dylan, you had your hand up.
Actually, Ben, if you don't mind, there was a question in chat a little while ago. So Dylan, if you would be willing to allow that question to go. It's from Richard Stang. So Richard, I don't know if you want to ask your question or if you just want me to read it in chat. But if you'd like to ask your question, please unmute and go ahead.
You can read it that way. It's pretty succinct.
Okay. So the question is, get back up to it here. Just went past it. My apologies. Here we go. Okay. Has there been an instance when a natural human person was able to gain standing to attack a corporation that has the property rights to conduct activities, in parentheses, and is actually conducting such an activity, end of parentheses, on its property that poisons, for instance, the drinking water that the human person depends on to stay alive. In this case, it would seem that you would have a matchup between the individual's rights to life and the corporation's assertion of constitutional rights.
I think that we have, I would say, literally thousands of instances where people try to do just that and are defeated because corporations are seen to have absolute rights in their property. And so and I see comments about factory farms destroy the land, they don't actually improve it. That's very true. And mining companies, when they extract gold or silver or lithium or whatever it might be, they're certainly not improving the land, but they own it. And our courts are very deferential to property rights, rights attached to property. So when it comes to your question used the term standing. Legal standing means that you have a legitimate complaint. You have a legitimate reason to go to the court and ask for some remedy for the violation of your rights. But by and large, the rights that our courts recognize are rights vested in property. And it doesn't have to be a corporation. It can be an individual landowner that seeks to protect their rights in property. However, when it's an individual landowner going up against a corporation, and the corporations can't claim rights, they're just property. But when the attorneys claim rights on behalf of the corporate property, the individual is in a weak position. And by the way, so is the municipality, for reasons we'll get into when we compare the different types of corporations, the private business corporation versus the public municipal corporation. Another way that the privileged property of a private corporation trumps the rights of the people to self-government, for instance. But to the question, have there been instances when an individual landowner went to court, was recognized as having legal standing because they went there to complain about some harm to their own property, the value of their property, and the court would say, "Oh, sure, you have a right to protect the value of the resale, say, value of your property, because this company is going to do something adjacent to your land that's going to diminish its value." Now, the court may say that you'll have to agree to a settlement where you take money to compensate you for the lost value of your land, rather than being vindicated for a different kind of standing that is not recognized, your right to clean water, for instance. If the corporation is going to destroy a stream that maybe your cattle drink from it, you may not be able to claim that, or you may be able to get some monetary value out of a settlement. But what about your rights? Your rights as an individual human being, or your rights as a community, as a member of a community, shared rights, democratic rights. Those types of rights are much more vulnerable to the exercise of the rights of privilege that come with incorporation. And so, have there ever been instances? Oh, sure, I'll bet there have. What is the percentage? I'll bet it's a low number.
So I guess the question is then where do we go from here? So if you can't have standing to assert, your right, the ability to survive, your human right, in face of these overwhelming property rights, where do we go from here? Can we change it? And how do we change it?
Well, we have a lot more ground to cover, and I'm not going to jump to the end of the book, so to speak. But I do want to say that I think it's important for us, and the reason I wrote this thing is I think it is important for us to understand the mess we're in because to answer your question, what can we do about it? I think that people won't believe me if I say we have to not take up arms, but we have to take up responsibility for our own communities and our own lives and stop relying and hoping that government is going to bail us out when we know that the game is rigged against us. And now, so what are the ways? Well, that's a whole other series of discussions, I would argue. What can we do? And I don't mean to put you off and say, well, you'll just have to wait for the surprise ending or something. But yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover. And the next piece I was going to cover, although I see that we are at our time, we have a little bit more to cover in part 3. Not much, but I think it's significant stuff that you're going to want to know about, because part of our problem is, I've always said, well, not always, when I was 8 I didn't, but I've often said that it's harder for people to unlearn what they believe but is false than it is to learn something new and is true. And a lot of what my book is about is trying to make a really tight case to show that what we believe is true, the stories we've been told about the federal Constitution being the font of democracy, or at least a democratic republic, and being the font of justice and the rest of it, that it's a story we're told, and it's a story that we're told from the time we're children, and it becomes part of our personal narrative about the country we live in. But I think it's imperative for us to give up our childish beliefs. Maybe we should be okay with being told there's no Santa Claus. Maybe we should be okay with being told there's no tooth fairy. And maybe we should be okay with understanding that the reason that George Washington threw in with the revolutionaries, who he certainly didn't agree with, he certainly didn't find Thomas Paine to be a good drinking buddy, more like somebody he could use, because Paine talked to the commoners and could get them to leave their farms and go fight the British. But Washington had another purpose in mind. And I want to talk about that in the next section when we get to it. I think we should wrap up because we said we're going to go till 8:30. And I will pick up with the subsection of part 3, and there's only a couple of sections. And its title, I Cannot Tell a Lie. Washington schlepped here. Schlepped, as in the Yiddish term. And so George Washington has a side to him that is a bit more materialistic and self-serving than we're usually told. That's where we're going next. And it is about deconstructing mythology, not because I hate America. I was born here. I was born in Philadelphia. Are you kidding? I was born with the Liberty Bell and all of those things. And I wish those stories were true. I wish all of it was true. But I'm not naive. We're the adults in the room. We're over time. I know some people had to go and have done so. If there's any questions, any comments before we go, let me be quiet. After just saying thank you for being here, please come back in July and we will pick up from where we left off.